Today, we're looking at human behavior and climate change. It's a very interesting, but also kind of worrying combination. But before we get to that, we'll have to start to understand why we do the things that we do in the first place.
In short, behavior analysis is, I kind of describe it as a way to view the world, what's influencing people, and how do we understand either our own behavior or some professions and fields, like how do we influence other people's behavior. So whether, it's economics or other forms of psychology, like we're all interested in kind of the similar thing. But there's also these weird intersections too. Like how do you get somebody to watch something without ever hearing or seeing them? That kind of interested me. And I think that's what filmmakers are really trying to do at the end of the day, is they're trying to influence people, which is what behavior analysis tries to do. And they're doing it through, this medium where you don't have direct access to the person. I was used to working directly with somebody, being able to take data and look at it. With this, you have to create something that essentially is almost perfect by the time you launch it, and in its ability to influence and kind of move people emotionally or whatnot.
This could be a question, is like, whenever you're trying to deliver something more informational, but also have that story element, like, I don't think I found that balance yet.
There's a group that I ran into at one of the first video conferences I went to. It was called the Harmon Brothers. Do you know the Squatty Potty ad that they did like 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago? I don't know what it was.
This is where your ice cream comes from. The creamy poop of a mystic unicorn.
It just is very different. And they're trying to sell a Squatty Potty to people that don't know that they need it. And they do it in a really interesting way. And I was at a conference listening to them talk about their methods. And it was one of those things like, how do we ensure that when we put this thing out there, that it will have the effect that we're looking for, like you're talking about? And they showed their process, which is they would write their script, ideate, put it together. They'd basically shoot a version of it, a little bit lower production wise, just to kind of get the concept out there. And then they would bring people in and have them watch it. And they'd make sure that they were pulling from whatever their target audience was, and diversifying that a little bit. And they'd have them watch. And they created what they called a laugh graph. So the idea was from 0 to 5, your belly laugh being a 5, 0 is like, I could not be more bored with this. And then they just did 5-second samples. So every 5 seconds was someone laughing or not. And they'd press play, have them watch. It was like a two-way mirror sort of thing. And they would just write, from 0 to 5, were people laughing? And they would aggregate all that data. Oh, look, we're seeing a consistent dip here. Like something's not working here. They'd go back, look at that, re-ideate, reshoot, re-bring people in. It was a very extensive process, but they shipped that when their laughs were continuously at the top of those belly laughs, that entire bit. And what was wild to me is we have procedures in our field that do the exact same thing with people, where what you're doing is you're trying to understand like what is influencing a particular behavior. You will chunk it in those 5-second bits. You will set up conditions in that environment, just like they did with playing the video, and you would take that data to understand what's going on there. You could deploy methods that'll help you figure out, like, is this, probability wise going to hit with our audience? And so like when I work on small independent films courses, I actually try to bring a few people over to my house and have them watch through what I'm going for, and actually record them as they're watching it. I try to I don't tell them beforehand about like what I'm looking for. They know I'm recording, they know all this sort of stuff. And I'm looking for, when do they glance over? When do they look away? When do they look on their phone? And those are little indications for me on the video of like where I could potentially work a little bit more. So that's how I've looked at it, is we could basically, get some test audiences here. But it's pretty extensive process. Does that help, Charlie?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because you're right. I think a lot of filmmakers approach it from an art standpoint, which is fantastic if you're making a piece of art. But if you're trying to do more either science communication or education, or I would argue even journalism to a degree, it's like you really want to make sure that that messaging has follow through and people get what, the intended goal is out of that. And I think having that data-driven approach is really, really interesting. I think a lot of filmmakers could take advantage of that, me included.
I don't know, maybe it's like a crutch of mine. Like I'm not good enough at the point to where I can drop that. Like I I could see, the Christopher Nolans of the world not needing something like this, or maybe needing different aspects of it, or maybe it's like they get that influence through different ways. But it's been a useful process for me. And most of what I'm working on is kind of documentary style, or it's like speaking to, like you said, some sort of science communication where you're trying to make sure that it's not misinterpreted in some sort of way. So I found it really beneficial.
We're also here to understand how we apply that in the context of climate change, and especially climate action.
I didn't mention this earlier, but behavior analysis really tries to always focus on an individual person, which is a little bit weird, but you can roll this up to society level, and I'll get there in a second. On an individual level, we're always trying to understand like what in the environment is influencing the behavior that I'm engaging in. Behavior will be anything a living organism does. So it doesn't matter if it's thinking, feeling, emoting, picking up, drinking some coffee, talking to a significant other, crying, listening to music, all of these things from our perspective is behavior. Some of them are a little bit easier to measure, like measuring your own thoughts is a little bit difficult, but measuring, somebody's overt behavior is a little bit easier. And so on an individual level, anybody that is trying to potentially understand, how can I be better when it comes to my impacts on the environment, could define whatever their goal may be, whether that's through consumption habits of what they're eating, consumption habits of how they're traveling, right? Those things could be set up. You could, with our methods, look at, where's my baseline consumption rate? And if your baseline consumption rate is not where you want it to be, figure out how, through changes in the environment, you can impact your consumption patterns. So everything is done on what's called a single subject analysis. They're not the most popular methods in science, mainly because there's not a lot of statistical analyses involved, and they're not trying to answer the question of how do we apply this at a group level. On the surface, though, it turns out that if you do a lot of single subject research, you do hundreds of these and verify them, you can get the same statistical certainties if you were doing larger group analyses at the start. I preface all that with an individual level is like what behavior analysis does extremely well. And a really good behavior analyst should be able to help somebody figure out where's your baseline at. If you're trying to increase it, how are we going to increase that? If you're trying to decrease it, how are we going to decrease those sort of things? Usually what happens in our science is we figured out, methods, whether maybe it's some visual prompts, right? Or maybe it's some environmental changes. So for example, like driving in gas-powered vehicles nowadays, a lot of the newer ones will, if you're stopped, shut off the engine temporarily, right? That shutting off the engine temporarily is something that was put in to try to preemptively prevent a certain amount of CO2 emitting in the air when it doesn't need to. These sort of like strategies can be deployed and see whether or not they affect that individual. Now, since we're all individual people, though, not all things affect us in similar ways. And so usually what happens is they're looking at what sort of prevalence does a certain procedure have on affecting people. Say it affects, only 60% of a group. Then when you scale that up, you're contributing to some sort of solution, but you still have to figure out that that other 40% of the population. And so a lot of what tends to happen is we'll figure out what's working on individual levels. Where does it fall apart? Like it no longer works for particular groups or situations. And then ideally, what happens is actually going into, at least in the States, the legislative state laws, federal laws, and trying to advocate that those scientific findings are implemented to where state laws, for example, will start to dictate what sort of changes happen on a day-to-day level. So it's always like individual data analysis, which can take literally like decades sometimes to really sort out and understand, then gets rolled up into, okay, now that we can trust this and we see where it works, where it doesn't work, let's scale it out to a population level. That's usually done at a state level or a regional level. From there, there's always this thin layer of politics and can you get it through the door, at least in America.